A manila envelope in a Tucson storage lot looks like a contained story. One car, one unit door, one handoff. Then federal agents move in. If that is all this was, it is already serious. But stories like this are rarely really about the parking lot. They are about the door that was open long before anyone stepped through it. Because the disturbing part is not just the allegation that sensitive missile information was being moved toward an Iranian-linked network, the disturbing part is the possibility that the route was not built with elite tradecraft at all. It may have been built with paperwork, routine, and silence. That is the version worth examining. The public-facing claim in the materials for this brief is dramatic. An NCIS-led counterintelligence operation culminates in 2 men being stopped in Tucson after an attempted transfer involving Tomahawk-related technical material. But at the time of writing, the exact case details in that narrative are not independently confirmed in the official public record I could locate, so this is not a verdict-driven reconstruction. It is a controlled examination of what the supplied case alleges and why the larger system it points to matters. Because outside that unverified case narrative, one thing is fully real: the Tomahawk matters, and it matters now. NAVAIR identifies Block V as the latest Tomahawk variant, with upgraded navigation and communications and additional capability tracks under the Block V and VB designations. Raytheon's Tucson operation is publicly identified as a Tomahawk contractor site. And in December 2024, the Department of Defense announced a contract for 131 full-rate production Block V tactical Tomahawks involving Raytheon and Tucson. By May 2026, KJZZ reported the Pentagon's proposed budget sought 785 new Tomahawks, a huge jump that reflects production pressure and strategic demand. That context changes the weight of the allegation immediately. If a supply chain breach touched even a small corner of a live production ecosystem like that, the story is not just about theft, it is about leverage, about insight, about whether an adversarial procurement pipeline managed to learn how an American weapons program really breathes, not in a classified vault at the Pentagon, but in the contractor layer where compliance and production meet. And that is where the supplied narrative becomes most interesting. Because it does not describe a mastermind smashing through hardened perimeter security. It describes something much more plausible and much more unsettling: a middle-tier administrative vulnerability, a buffer system, disposal language, inventory coding. A channel between what should be visible and what allegedly stopped being visible. That is exactly the kind of breach architecture that keeps counterintelligence professionals awake, not because it is cinematic, because it is ordinary. In the materials you provided, the alleged red flag is not a midnight intrusion or a server breach. It is a discrepancy in inventory disposition, components marked one way, accountability records left unfinished. A category that looks technical enough to avoid casual scrutiny and boring enough to avoid panic. That is how serious internal compromise often hides, inside categories nobody expects to become the center of a national security case. And if that part of the narrative is true, then the real story begins the moment someone noticed not what was missing, but what was never properly closed. That is the difference between a dramatic crime and a structural failure. The broader public record supports the idea that Iranian procurement efforts do not always rely on direct state signatures. DOJ has described recent cases in which Iranian-linked actors allegedly used front companies, shell entities, spoofed communications, and indirect commercial channels to obtain U.S. origin technology for sanctioned military end users, including the IRGC. That pattern matters here because it means the most credible version of this type of threat is not a movie version spy ring. It is a procurement network disguised as a business. And if you place that verified pattern next to the supplied Tucson narrative, a larger logic starts to appear. The alleged courier matters less than the route. The alleged insider matters less than the permissions. The envelope matters less than the months of normality required to make that envelope possible. That is the system under the surface angle. Because a modern defense program is not secured only by guards, badges, and classified stamps. It is secured by process integrity, by whom can relabel, who can delay disposition, who can create a staging category, who can move a questionable item one desk further down the line without triggering a human challenge. A mature adversarial network does not need to defeat every layer. It only needs one layer to become administratively soft. And if the supplied account is even directionally true, the alleged softness here was procedural, not spectacular. Procedural. That is worse. Spectacular failures are visible. Procedural failures scale. A fake company name can be caught. A broken inventory rule can repeat for months. A suspicious phone call can be flagged. A trusted employee following an altered internal workflow can look like business. A perimeter breach gets attention. An internal exception gets normalized. That is how isolated incidents become ecosystems. And this is where the story stops being just about one possible subcontractor case and starts pointing at something bigger in the U.S. defense industrial base. America's advantage in advanced weapons is not only in design, it is tempo, it is manufacturing continuity. It is calibration, quality assurance, subcontractor discipline, export control awareness, and visibility across a chain of companies that do not all sit inside the same building or under the same direct command. That system can be powerful. It can also be stretched. And when it is stretched by demand, urgency, and volume, small administrative blind spots become strategically valuable. That matters in a period when Tomahawk demand is publicly surging. It matters when contractors are asked to scale. It matters when adversarial procurement networks have already shown patience, deniability, and commercial camouflage, which leads to the most uncomfortable question in this story. If a network wanted insight into a missile program, would it really start with the missile? Or would it start with the subcontractor whose job is too technical for outsiders, too routine for headlines, and too trusted for constant suspicion? That is a much colder theory of access. It is also more believable, and it changes the emotional center of the story. Because once you move past the arrest image, if the arrest happened as described, the fear is no longer the handoff itself. The fear is the audit trail behind it, the months before it, the approvals nobody revisited, the advisories nobody cross-checked. The assumption that certain workflows were too minor to become national security events. Those are the kinds of assumptions that hostile acquisition programs feed on. The supplied narrative leans heavily on one idea, that the system did not collapse in one night, it drifted. If that is accurate, then the breach was not born in the storage lot. It was born in tolerated ambiguity, in fields left blank, in categories accepted without challenge. In the distance between what the prime contractor thinks it can see and what a smaller node inside the chain can quietly reinterpret. And when a system is vulnerable in that way, a single arrest does not end the threat. It only proves the threat found a seam. That is why the unresolved part of this story matters more than the dramatic part. Not whether one man took money, not whether one courier arrived on schedule, but whether the same incentives, workflows, and blind spots still exist elsewhere in the chain. Because if one alleged route was built through disposal codes, false labeling, or procedural buffering, then the next route does not need to copy the same method exactly. It only needs to find the next under-audited corner, the next low-drama process, the next place where responsibility is distributed widely enough that no one person feels the full shape of the risk. And that possibility is what makes this story feel less like a closed case and more like a systems warning. There is another reason this angle carries weight. Public institutions often speak in two different languages at once. One is the language of arrests, charges, press releases, and named defendants. The other is the quieter language of after-action reviews, compliance changes, contractor directives, and internal damage assessments. The first language tells the public who got caught. The second tells insiders what really failed. The first language gives you the headline. The second gives you the truth structure. And in stories like this, the truth structure is almost always bigger than the defendant list. So if this alleged Tucson operation becomes more publicly documented later through indictments, court filings, or agency statements, the most important pages may not be the ones describing the handoff. They may be the pages describing the process map. Who approved what? Who saw which advisory? What thresholds were missed? Which controls existed only on paper? Which anomalies were visible but never elevated? That is where the real documentary lens should stay. Not on glamour, on architecture, not on spy movie mythology, on compliance weakness. Not on the question of whether one envelope moved, on the question of what kind of environment allows an envelope like that to matter at all. Because the most serious threat in this story is not the possibility that someone tried to sell secrets. It is the possibility that the route to those secrets did not require extraordinary brilliance, only access, only patience, only a system that looked intact from the outside. And if that is true, then the arrest scene is not the ending. It is the first visible sign that something underneath had already been working for a long time. That is why this story should be approached with caution, with verification, and with discipline, but it should not be dismissed. Because even in its unconfirmed state, it points towards something the public record already supports. Tomahawk production is strategically important, adversarial procurement networks do exist, and front company acquisition models are real. The unresolved question is whether this alleged case was one more attempt to exploit that reality, or one of the few times the system caught the move before the full picture left the lot. Either way, the larger structure is the real story. And if the larger structure is still standing, this file is not finished.